Without further ado, I will pass over to today's moderator, Jason Hemingway, Chief Marketing Officer at Phrase. Over to you.
Thank you, Clara, and welcome to everybody on behalf of everyone at Phrase. As Clara said, I'm the CMO at Phrase and responsible for all our marketing initiatives across the board. So today we're going to be talking about navigating the hype around hyperautomation, and the more keen-eyed amongst the audience will see that this is very much a topic that at Phrase we've been really championing over the past few months. And we're going to deep dive into it and talk about all of the things around hyperautomation. But before we get into that, I want to introduce the two people that will be helping us navigate the hype around hyperautomation. Firstly, Dr. Arle Lommel, who is Director of Data Services at CSA Research, who will be giving us the more analytical side of this and the more independent viewpoint from the broader market. And then our very own Simone Bonenberger, who will be talking about how Phrase kind of really sees, or how we at Phrase see hyperautomation, and kind of how we link that kind of concept into what our customers are looking at, how we're developing products, and really getting into the detail of what it means from a technology point of view. So welcome to both of you. And again, welcome to everybody who's listening into the webinar today. So let's get straight into it. And I think probably the best place to start with a question like this is to put the idea of hyperautomation into some kind of market context. And I'm going to start with you, Arle, to really look at or really tell everybody where you see what's happening in the marketplace today, and why hyperautomation is kind of linked to those market developments. So if you will, I'll hand over to you to give us a little bit of that market perspective.
Sure. So at CSA Research, we've been talking lately about the market entering what we're calling the post-localization era. And one of the characteristics of this is that you're going to have more content streams coming from more directions, from more places within the enterprise, touching on more diverse audiences in more languages. And all this means that we're looking at a potential explosion in the amount of content that's being translated or processed in things akin to translation. And when we do a thought experiment at CSA Research on occasion, where we look at the total volume of content generated every day and what's processed by human translators and MT, and we came up with a number recently, which basically suggests the amount that's actually being translated versus what should be looks something like a rounding error on zero. There's just so much out there that remains untranslated because it's too expensive, or translation takes too long. And this has real impacts on keeping people from full participation in digital economies and accessing content they need. And one just, back of the envelope estimation we did, saying if we wanted to translate just 1% of what's interesting out there into economically significant languages, we would require the entire population of the European Union, China, and Indonesia doing nothing but translating. Well, clearly that's not scalable. So we have to automate something if we're going to get to where, arguably just addressing the tip of the iceberg. And that has to go beyond what LSPs have done so far, which is typically automating moving files and stuff. It really has to become more pervasive in the LSP and the enterprise side.
Yeah, I think I mean, what an interesting statistic that you threw out there. Isn't that interesting that just doing it by humans alone is just not possible by any stretch of the imagination? And I think you also hit on a topic that I was only discussing this morning with some of my team, where you think about the concept of automation. Well, we've pretty much been doing that as an industry, or a technology side at least. You've been doing automation. Lots of things have been automated. And perhaps I'll hand over a little bit to Simone to kind of articulate, well, what does hyperautomation mean? If we've already been doing a bit of that automation, we see the value in that. What do we mean by hyperautomation? And with that market context, that in order to do you know, the level of localization or translation that actually businesses can unlock a huge amount of value if they can do some of that, you know, percentile difference of translating valuable content. Why is hyperautomation the answer, or what is it?
Yeah, I think starting at why we're only currently translating a margin of error in terms of content that's available. I think it's really, we're stuck until a while ago, we were really stuck at a certain level of automation that could be achieved. So I think machine translation has been around for a while. We have very well established rule-based approaches to translation, but the reality is that that only covers a specific type of asset in the localization workflow, usually low value assets that where the quality isn't very important, and where also the scalability isn't necessarily key and front of mind. So what we mean by hyperautomation is really the next generation of automation where you can tackle workflows and processes and human steps that couldn't be automated before. So with that, I mean pockets of value and bottlenecks like the LQA process, which is very labor intense with annotations and other things. There's a lot of space in the pre-translation workflow. So really moving the entire end-to-end localization process into a no-touch human by exception automation piece. And that means it's hyper-automated. Humans are really there to deal with the exceptions. And that's really fundamentally required because, like Arle mentioned earlier, at Phrase, we really believe that the future will see a proliferation of content for enterprise customers and global organizations. That will be a unique opportunity to provide much more targeted, tailored, or personalized experiences to their customers if they get it right? That's a real market advantage. But that with that comes a huge volume increase in terms of content that needs to get handled. And it's just impossible to do that with human labor, even if we're just looking at the exceptions. And the only place to get there is through hyperautomation. So really laying the foundations with scalable infrastructure and the right AI tooling and controls around it to move human processes into automated processes.
Yeah, and I think there's a tremendous amount of value that can drive for customers. Would one of you care to talk a little bit more on that? So let's say a business is doing it. What value do we think that hyperautomation can unlock for a business? If we can try and estimate that kind of, why should somebody think about it?
Well, maybe I can toss out. So we routinely do a study that we call Can't Read, Won't Buy, and it looks at the impact of availability of language on global consumers. And, you know, one of the high-level statistics we have is that, you know, 75% of people globally speaking aren't going to buy unless content's in their language. But when you actually start looking at their behavior, it's even worse than that, because that 75% compounds at various stages of the customer journey. So, but if you aren't speaking to someone in their language in an e-commerce or online sales kind of situation, you may be talking about only 2 or 3% of the audience that would gladly buy from you can make it through the gauntlet of obstacles where they can't find what they need. They can't read it in their language. They can't understand the product description. They can't pay because they don't have localized payment and so forth. So if you can address that, you know, you could be theoretically talking about boosting sales in some markets 20-fold just by provisioning language at every stage where it's needed. So this isn't some marginal thing. This can make or break your international markets.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think also currently marketing teams are already spending a significant amount of money on personalization. It's just very expensive the way it happens today. And I think the value, it's easy to illustrate if we think about a large global organization with a broad set of assets, let's say an app, a website, some user-generated content or reviews on the website, some customer support, user manuals. All of that needs to get localized into different locales. And today it gets localized either partially or more slowly. It's very often that we see customers who've built an app for an English-centric market first. They were successful, then expanded globally, and are really struggling now to translate that experience from the original market into the target market, or they only do it partially because they can't afford it, and their engagement drops. It's just much lower than elsewhere. That's just one aspect of it. But the other challenge is to bring this in. The most successful way to engage customers is to bring everything online at the same time. So you get, as you target and your end users with different signals at the same time. That means all of these assets need to go live on day one, or they need to get updated on day one at the same time all across the portfolio. And that's really, really difficult because it involves so many processes, so many manual steps. So with hyperautomation, we really believe we can enable localization on day one across all channels. And that is extremely valuable.
Yeah, it's hugely valuable. And any business that is looking to geographical expansion, it's also the speed of execution, isn't it? It's the speed at which you can do this, because I think everybody's aspiration was we want to do more of it, but it's prohibitively either too hard or costly to kind of do it at scale with the current sort of human-based way of thinking about the world. So hyperautomation unlocks that. So it's an important, would you say it's an important evolution for localization? Because, you know, in today's economy, you need to be moving quickly, right? That's just a thing people need to think about. And if you don't, perhaps the competitors that maybe have a better handle on this will do. So do you see it as a logical evolution for localization? Arle, maybe over to you as the analyst.
You know, we've been talking about it for years. We used a different term, but it's very much the same concept. We called it lights out project management, and it's the idea of the no touch thing. And you know, we've been slowly seeing people moving in this direction. Often, what they have been hindered by in the past was too many exceptions and too much complexity. And here, to come to your point, this is where AI can start addressing some of this by finding ways to deal with all the edge cases and variants that have kept this from succeeding. And once you do that, the real advantage for the LSP or the enterprise is probably, you know, half of the cost of localization is on overheads that, if they could be automated, then aren't needed. They're in a sense, they're waste in the process because they don't contribute in the end, which is getting something over here in, you know, German over here in Albanian and making a sale. Now, they haven't been waste today because you needed them to do it. But if we have better ways to do it, they should be eliminated because they aren't productive anymore. And I think every LSP and every enterprise needs to be looking at this, because their goal is to benefit humanity by, well, maybe I sound a little naive there. We're in a capitalist worldview and whatever, but still, their goal is to give people something that hopefully benefits them. And if language is standing in the way, it's imperative that we do things to get it out of the way.
Absolutely. I think that concept of customer-led growth is a good way of looking at it. If you want to grow through your customer base and you want to become profitable via customer-led growth, you need to be thinking about how you service, how you engage those customers, how you grow via those customers. And I think you hit on something there, Simone, that it's kind of, as a marketer, is very close to my heart, is this whole notion of personalization. And I think the notion of personalization without, you know, localizing, or at the very least translating it into languages your customers understand, I think it's flawed, because how can you start with personalization in one language without thinking about the whole thing? It seems very strange to me. But the goals are essentially the same: is customer engagement will drive growth, will drive customer-led growth. So I think you also said there, Arle, about edge cases. What it leads me to another question that I think is an interesting one, which is, what sort of language-related tasks can enterprises and LSPs automate? And then the second half of that is, what perhaps should they try not to automate?
So I think there's two cases of things that should be automated. And notice I'm saying should be. I think it's almost a moral imperative to do it. The first one are things that are repetitive and predictable. Things that, if you're throwing a person at it, if they have to click the same darn button all day long, that's wasting their talent. So anything that is repetitive and thoroughly understood can and should be automated. The second class are things that maybe aren't repetitive, but that are difficult for humans, but easy for machines. A good example would be you've sent something out to translation into German, you get it back in its formal, and you say, oh, actually, I wanted informal. And previously to recent developments in AI, that meant you hand it back to the linguist who says, I can't believe I have to do this. And they spend all day adjusting it for no benefit. Whereas now you could automate that using large language models and other things and get a very good response in a matter of minutes. And then maybe, the human comes in and fixes it. Now, the things that shouldn't be automated are the ones that require human intelligence and creativity. So if your automation process can identify those and say, okay, we need a human here because, hey, it's a new key term for marketing, or this really requires artful expression. When you can identify those, you bring humans in where they're adding value and where they're doing interesting things rather than boring things.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think that whole, I mean, Simone, I'll hand over to you in a second, but I think that whole notion of human by exception is an interesting one, because I actually think that the wording should probably be human where it's most valuable, not necessarily by exception. It's like, where does a human actually really make the difference here? Not, as you said, pressing buttons to make things work. I mean, Simone, have you got any thoughts on that topic?
Yeah, I think I like the way how Arle approached it in terms of use cases. So where we have repetitive tasks or where humans are not suitable for the jobs and machines are, but really it's not just that, it's also I think enterprise customers and organizations have to look at every corner for automation right now, because the future with more proliferated content is upon us, and it's such a competitive advantage if you can tap into that or not. But it also fundamentally comes down to if you have the right infrastructure in place, right? So there is one thing to have repetitive use cases and, for example, assets that are very suitable for automation, like user-generated content or marketing materials. But if you don't have the right data assets or infrastructure in place to connect them, there's not going to be significant automation. So the way I describe this usually is in the localization space in particular, we have a very fragmented setup. So usually a lot of different technologies have to come together across the entire end-to-end workflow in order to solve for a localization use case. So there are content management systems, there are some workflow automation tools, there are some AI tools that assess quality, there are some AI aggregators, there are some publication tools, there are some LQA tools. It's incredible. And their data repositories, how much has to come together to make to bring the localization workflow to life. Now, to drive next generation automation, that is really like a country road with lots of intersections and roundabouts. But what customers need to look at is really a data highway, right? So seamlessly connected systems with the right data repositories that are clean and up to speed and have the quality to drive models to provide personalized content. So it's not just a combination, it's not just looking at the use case, but also where in the organization do we have the right infrastructure in place to leverage AI for those use cases.
Yeah,
maybe if I could just toss in there that I think this is an absolutely key point. And one thing most enterprises find is they've been throwing away historically what they now need to do this because they didn't know they needed to capture it. And those that by some fluke of circumstance or foresight captured it really have an advantage now, because there's so much that can be learned from all this data and it helps put everything together. So that's, if you want to go beyond just basic automation, you really need everything Simona talked about.
So data being a foundational component part, are there any other component parts of technology that you think are very important, Simone? I mean, you alluded to some of them, but go into a little touch more detail, perhaps.
Yeah, I think the world of hyperautomation actually requires quite a lot, right? So I've mentioned I think centralized underlying infrastructure. And that's often not in place because of this fragmented marketplace. So really underlying architecture to connect your system seamlessly is building block number one. If that's not in place, it's going to be very hard to leverage the best of machine learning. And leveraging the best of machine learning is not just to have AI infused at one workflow step in the process, but really holistically across every single step. And it will be a portfolio of different AI solutions depending on where you're at. So really the underlying infrastructure has to be there. You need the data repositories and data assets. So translation memories are incredibly powerful. They're an amazing competitive mode for organizations to generate personalized content that reflects their tone of voice, that really stands for who they are. But unless these translation memories are clean and organized and up to speed, they're not going to be very helpful in the AI journey, right? In this automation journey. And I think that's why I think a lot of focus will go back on these translation memories and how to clean them and maintain them and curate them. But also where organizations had a slower start, not everyone has translated and localized for the last 20 years and has that wealth of information. Really finding tools and possibilities to build up that data mode really, really quickly. So it's data assets, is the centralized infrastructure, or like the data highway, how I call it. It's a broad set of AI tools. That's really interesting because last year was all about JetGPT and LLMs, and they do certain jobs really well, but they're very expensive. It's hard to make them reliable and robust and sustainable. There are data privacy issues around them. There are other neural network approaches that are far more powerful for certain use cases and more cost effective. So really it's having a portfolio of different machine learning models or AI approaches at your disposal and use them depending on the purpose of the asset. It has to be premium quality, reviewed with GPT at the end. If good enough also works, you can use a traditional approach that saves you a lot of money and is far more scalable. Then, in addition to that, absolute clarity and control over the process. Nobody can afford to automate without understanding what the quality looks like at every single step of this localization process. And that's a huge issue in the industry right now, because we understand sometimes what the source content looks like. We may understand what the final output looks like, but often we have different methods of assessing quality along the way, and they don't speak to each other. So a holistic framework that really follows an asset from generation all the way to pre-translation, editing, LQA to the very end, and have a holistic perspective on how well that asset performs and giving you control over it is really critical. And then the last one, because that's one of my favorite topics, is really dynamic workflows. So to move into this world of automation, not every asset can be treated in the same way. So for example, this is not just a difference of a marketing campaign or user-generated content. Even within the same category, sometimes content is been produced with a lot of typos and errors, and it needs to be cleaned up first before it's even suitable for AI or any type of machine to touch it. That requires different business logic, business workflows to pick up on these assets and to route them into different loops to get to the end result of maximizing automation. So I think these are the components I would say any organization needs to be able to stitch together to think about the next 3 years in automation and being able to leverage something like generative AI in the most effective way.
Yeah, go on, Arle, over to you.
I was just toss in here that I think, Simona, you made a very good point that you need different approaches for different things. And one of the, I think, problems last year was when everybody said, oh, let's just toss it all at ChatGPT, is they found this doesn't work. And in many cases, there are older established technologies that work far, far better, are more efficient, and do a better job. And you need to be able to integrate all those. And anybody who says, I have one silver bullet that can solve this, no, it's going to take lots of things. And one of the big developments we're seeing that's enabling this is so many of these things that used to sit off in silos now can talk to each other. And it's really enabling tremendous things right now.
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting, I've been in this AI industry for a while, and I remember how hard it was to sell any AI-powered product to any executive, because the question was always, can it really do what it promises to do? And last year was the opposite. CXOs ask everyone, localization managers, budget folders, you have to use GPT, you have to try it, we want you to use it. It was incredible to see that dynamic being put upside down.
Yeah, I think it permeates every part of the business, isn't it? It's now, you know, how are you leveraging the latest in Gen AI to get the best out of your teams, the best out of what you're focused on. So it's everywhere, and localization teams are absolutely no different. And in fact, probably one of the sort of forerunners to lots of teams of how best you can use it, because there's a logical place to put it. So when we're thinking about all of this, there's a lot for somebody working in localization to think about, isn't there? So what are the challenges as you see them in a bit more detail for them for people to look out for and try and prepare for? So how should they think about that? I don't know who wants to go first.
I can start.
Yeah.
I think, and this is, I think my perspective is obviously shaped by us as a vendor looking into the market. But I think the first part to look at is the use case. So in these localization portfolio today, what are very suitable assets? So that are high volume, where we have a lot of them, that are very expensive or absorbing a lot of manual labor. So the use case, what's our risk profile around these assets? If you're new to automation, don't start with the most sophisticated assets, because you need to put very sophisticated technology in place and exception management, etc. Start with assets that are lower risks. For example, user-generated content is my favorite example at the moment. Think about the use case, the asset, and then also whether the data is available to actually drive automation on these assets. All the points I've mentioned earlier, including, very importantly, your cost objectives with that. The challenge of many AI solutions is, or of AI in general, is that it works often in a lab, but once you put it in production and it touches real data, it often fails, or because the use case and the objectives and the success metrics haven't been clearly defined, a lot of money gets wasted and sunk, and it doesn't really live up to expectations. So I would say start with the use case and with the data you have available.
Yeah, I would agree. I just, with this bit about it sometimes being, working in the lab is we see a lot of applications, as we say, designed by engineers for engineers. And that's not a compliment. You end up with these things that if you operate in their fixed view of the world, it works great, but the moment you step outside, it doesn't. So that's been an issue. I think we're seeing a lot of improvement in this lately. There's a lot more focus on how do we make this usable. With the use case bit, I absolutely agree. I think one other way that some enterprises think about this, perhaps, is by doing what we call a content audit. So getting a hold of what is it you're producing, because often they don't know. It's, accreted over time. There's, 50 different content types. And when they start looking at them, they can say, oh, these 6 things really should be one. And then you can start building the use case based on what you see that you're already doing. It's a bit of a chicken and an egg thing, because you can also, but you learn a lot when you start really examining what you're doing, and then understanding risk is critical. I think one of the biggest shifts I've seen in the industry in the last couple of years is to move away from quality as we have to be perfect to what is the risk that this content poses if it's translated incorrectly. And then you can start making intelligent decisions about how to approach it. And like Simona said, don't start with the complex one. Also, don't start with the super high risk one. If I think about it, if you translated legal contracts fully automated and there's a mistake in terms of law there, that can really bite you. So you can use it to help, but that's not where you should start. But user-generated content or most technical documentation are great places to start, because they're low stakes, but you also understand them and you know what needs to go into them very, very well.
Yeah, or I think the other, and I have to do this, the other way to flip the perspective is obviously look at solutions that are wrapped around a use case, right? So for example, we focused recently on automating the LQA process because we understand the process. It has very defined metrics. it's very clear what output we're achieving, right? So this is a contained use case and there's a vendor solution for it. That's the other way to look at it. Instead of trying to solve the problem yourself, go into the market and see what problem pieces have been solved in the market already.
Yeah.
Cool. Good advice on there. So asking you again, both of you, for a bit more advice or a bit more thinking around, based on what you've said, we've talked about challenges to prepare for. What do you think the implications of hyperautomation are for localization teams and professionals working in localization?
So there's a couple of scenarios. And the one that I think a lot of people jump to is that this is like the asteroid heading towards the Earth to obliterate the dinosaurs. I don't think that's what's going to happen. But the worry is, you automate everything, MT gets good enough, and, why do we need translators? I think the implication, though, is very different, that by automating so much of what can be automated, it opens up room for humans to be actually doing more, because the overall cost comes down. You're much more efficient. It makes it more accessible. And then you can have humans step in where they're really adding that value. But with a vastly expanded content universe, yeah, maybe they're making much, much lower on paper per word, but they're making much more per hour because of where they're contributing. So I'm fundamentally optimistic. Yes, we'll see some displacement. There's going to be some churn, but I think in the end, this is probably the best thing that could happen for the individuals working in this field.
And Simone, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think similar to Arle, I think we'll see huge gains in productivity, which we have to see if we want to enable a future of targeted, more personalized content for end users, right? It's not possible without. But I think roles would also change, because in this world of automation, it's not a world that runs on its own. What I've mentioned earlier, how do you think about your first use case? What assets are suitable for automation? What does the data quality need to look like to drive that automation? What does a targeted and personalized user experience look like? Those are all skills that we will need in the future. A lot of domain expertise around the actual language, domain expertise around the data, domain expertise around the experience. I think that's really where roles will shift, but we will need a lot more of that experience in the future.
I agree. And would both of you or either one of you agree with what I'm about to say, which is I think it's also the opportunity for localization teams to get more embedded into the strategic sort of fabric of a business. Because if you think about it, the limitations at the moment, time, cost, people, are kind of meaning that you can only focus on those small percentiles of what needs to be done or what could be done, let's say. As you get access to more, more output, more quality output, whether you use machines in one respect and then humans in another, it means that a localization team can get more involved in more localization projects around a business that are around customers, how to build more engagement. Therefore, this is my theory, therefore they become much more integral and much more important. Not that they aren't today, I'm just saying it becomes even more important.
Yeah, one of the things I mentioned earlier, this concept of post-localization, and one of the things we're seeing that we predicted with this is that these content requests and needs are going to come from more diverse sources in the enterprise. And if the localization teams don't become more strategic, they run the risk of becoming irrelevant. So it's not just that they have the opportunity, they have the imperative. Because if they don't, whatever team out there says we need this in Swahili and Albanian and Chuvash next year is just going to bypass them. So they really have, they have to step up their game, but that comes with a tremendous opportunity for them.
Interesting. Any thoughts on that, Simone?
Yeah, I think with more automation, what we will see and what I hope to see is that localization teams turn into that very visible superpower of go-to-market strategies, because it's the fundamental pillar to enter a new market and keep the audience engaged and make money is through localization teams. And I think with greater automation and freed up time or capacity, localization experts will guide the company much more into what content is successful, what's the ROI on how we've localized, do we need to change the workflows, do we need to try and test something else, and that can be much more dynamic and better, but they will become the expert in terms of the market expansion. I think they will play a much better and bigger role strategically in that discussion.
Yeah, I'll add to that I think one of the roles they're going to play is right along with this is in managing corporate knowledge across languages and across silos. And this is really I think the imperative, because right now too many processes are disconnected. They're not coordinated. And often the localization team is the only one that has oversight into all of this. So if they can start gathering that data and managing that knowledge, they become a vital asset to the enterprise.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought as well. Okay, well, look, I think we've reached the end of our preset questions, and we're just about on time, which is excellent work. And I'm going to go over to the questions that have been asked by the audience attending today. And I'll start off with this one. Integrating multiple technologies can be complex. What strategies does Phrase recommend for effectively managing the integration of disparate technologies in this hyper-automated environment? So again, it's just probably furthering something you've already talked about. We've talked about the need to integrate, but is there any advice we can give? I mean, obviously we do this on a relatively daily basis as a business.
Yes, so I think the name of the game is really move away from a fragmented tech stack and towards a centralized tech stack. And there are different ways of doing that. The way we're doing that at Phrase is that we're trying to bring a platform to market that is a central hub for various use cases and covers most of them, right? So to really minimize the need for additional technology around it. Now, the obvious benefit of that is that everything we build is seamlessly integrated with each other. These data pipelines and data highways I've mentioned earlier that are required to drive hyperautomation and get the best of machine learning and AI is really what we ensure amongst our own capabilities. So that's really one part that informs how we develop our products and what we do, and also how that then fits into the wider ecosystem. So that's how we approach that.
Cool. I think one of the other questions on here we may have answered as we went through, but it's worth asking a little bit again in case somebody didn't kind of catch it. What are the common pitfalls? Now, we talked about thinking about use cases as the way of looking at it. I think one of the pitfalls, I'll just start off the answer and you can jump in afterwards. I think one of the common pitfalls is trying to look at it all as a whole and just sort of saying, right, we've got to do everything and thinking about it. And it can often seem too complicated, too difficult to do. And I think we've talked about, think about the use cases, look at the bite-sized bits, do the content audit of the things that are important. I think that's maybe the advice that would be, it's a common pitfall to think about that it is a huge thing. The idea really is to focus on, get a few test cases going, think about how you can build incrementally. Don't try and do it all at once is my advice from what I know, but I'll hand it over to the experts in the room.
Well, if you want me to go, I'll say one thing when you're looking at this is you are almost certainly both over and underestimating the complexity when you start. And things you think will be easy will be hard, and things you think will be hard will be easy. And so you really need to have partners with experience in this to help guide you if you're just starting out. They will help you avoid pitfalls. I think that's really one of the biggest things I could say is if you haven't done this on your own, find somebody who can help guide you.
I think that's good advice. Simone, anything to add?
I think one of the biggest pitfalls is really, or what I've seen a lot is there are these two extremes in the market, maybe less so this year, but definitely last year. So the idea that one model can do it all. So whatever my problem is, I'm just going to throw ChatGPT at it. And that's clearly, there is no model that can solve all use cases, and it will take a long time for us to move into such a world. It's also very costly and it's not scalable. So I think that really thinking through the use case, if you need certain latency or volumes, or if you have certain budget constraints, GPT is not the best solution. You have to be very targeted in where you use it. So that's extreme number one. The second one is really around the management of this automation. So there is what models and what do we do, but the management. So how do we work now that we have an automated workflow? What data do we collect to ensure that these models continue to perform? How do we spot issues? How do we put data governance in place to ensure that our privacy is maintained and our data doesn't leak elsewhere? These are all things that you need to think through as well, and that are often a secondary and afterthought, but that should be critical to any decisions and how you approach automation.
Good stuff. Okay, thanks. I'll go back to the question board. This is from Wanda. I shall beyond that, I'm fond of any means to get rid of manual steps, but my experience regarding the place of the human in the loop does not reflect the vision experts transmit at any corner of the internet. So I think what that means, we need to get rid of manual steps. The vision here does not necessarily reflect an experience, and maybe that's because it's becoming more prevalent. I don't know. I mean, if someone wants to handle that human in the loop versus what's actually in reality, I think is the kind of question. Is that really a reality is probably the question.
Well, maybe what I'll say is I think it's interesting that the term human in the loop was used there, because I really don't like that term, because what that has mostly meant in the past is that people turn into MT janitors. They're cleaning up garbage. They have no control. They have no say. I think what hyperautomation has the potential to deliver is what we call human at the core, where these become assistive to the human rather than reductive to the human. Now, all this has to play out. Is it possible that, this further marginalizes humans as it plays out? I think and I'm speaking broadly as an industry, we're the ones who get to decide that. And if we decide we want to elevate the human and center it where it's needed, that's what will happen. But if we just hand this over to, people who are total techno-utopians, and I know I sounded like that earlier, but I don't think I'm naive in it. But if we just hand it over to people, say, oh, AI will solve everything, yeah, we're going to see people turn into the human in the loop janitors at the end of the process. We need to fight that. And I think what we're discussing today is one way to do that.
Yeah, we're not I think the manual step that will still be there is human in control, right? It's not just human in the loop, it's humans in control. This automation, someone is still accountable for it. Someone still needs to ensure that it does the job, drives the ROI, will get changed, will get adjusted. That is all that requires an oversight. And I think that's where we will see the manual steps in the future. I think it depends where you sit in that localization process chain, right? There are areas and pockets that are still heavily manual today, but we're, I think, at the cusp of automating that right now. There are other things that have already been automated. So it's really the vantage point of where you're at right now that will drive your experience around automation. The bottom line is that even manually intense tasks, and I use LQA as an example because there's a lot that goes into annotation. Some companies couldn't even afford it as part of their quality assurance. That's one of the areas that we're now automating, right? Next is something else. But so with Gen AI and the tool of AI, we have the broad toolkit of AI approaches we have at our disposal. We're now working ourselves through all the workflows, through all the processes.
Yeah, and I still think the human has a part to play in thinking about those things and how they are deployed and when to use them, when not to. So it's very much that human at the core. I like that concept, actually, Arle. That's very good. And I think there's a question on the actual Slido here that's, what about accountability, liability for hyper-automated translations? Any worries? And I think that plays back into this, right? That's there might be worries, but that's why there needs to be some degree of oversight and gatekeeping and control, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think even though Sam Altman tells you he will foot your lawsuit and the bill that comes with it, I don't think that's true. I think ultimately companies are responsible for the AI that they deploy, and that's why you need to be quite diligent in your selection process, but you need to understand what type of models are deployed and what they do and why. So that topic around explainability. And that's the issue with large language models. They're harder to control because they're being trained on a large, vast amount of data. They're being changed outside of our control. It takes a lot more sophistication to ensure that you know what's happening there.
Great. And then just a couple more questions. One is easy. Can we send the recording afterwards? Yes, of course we can. And another, Simone brought the concept of customer engagement in order to justify the introduction of hyperautomation. Arle says it's necessary to benefit humans and free them from repetitive tasks. But have ever translations which needed this level of repetitive action been used for engaging with customers? So what I think the question is are the translations that are needed just for repetitive tasks useful for engaging with customers? I would imagine that the answer is yes, because not to lead the witness, but I'll let you sort of ruminate or talk on that.
I'd say anybody who doesn't speak a major language and has tried to deal with the online world would say, yes, and yes, we need this. Even something like a service manual can be vital for engaging and solving someone's problem. Years ago, now this goes back to the 1990s, there was a study done by IBM in which they looked at one of their product offerings in Brazil. And the Brazilian users of it all said, oh, we're perfectly happy with English. We understand it. It's great. When they tested their comprehension and their ability to use the product, they found they had severe deficits because it wasn't available in Portuguese, even though they thought they could use it. Now, multiply that out for everybody out there. Yeah, there's repetitive things that people desperately need, even if they don't know they need it today.
Yeah.
I would add to that I think we need to cast a very generous definition of the term repetitive, because what is also repetitive is writing copy and content for specific, very granular target audiences and segments. Like, I don't know, women in their 20s and 40s who sit in China, they have very different medical needs than women who are 50 and sit in England, right? So that is a repetitive task. It's way too expensive to justify human labor to do that. But with AI generating this content and adjusting it for the target audience based on your own data repositories, that's a very powerful use case to drive engagement, be much more targeted and personalized. It is not your traditional repetitive step, but there is some repetition in it. I think we just need to be a bit more generous how we define repetition.
And I also think you have to be probably a bit more generous in how you define customer engagement, because customer engagement can be a good service delivered every time. Or communication delivered every time, and over time, because engagement is trust over time in my book. Anyway, well, look, I think we're just about at the end. We've got one final question. How do you think you can manage polysemy through automation? So polysemy meaning, well, Arle, you can tell us, you're probably the best place. Coexistence of many possible meanings for a word or phrase. I looked it up on the internet.
Well, I would introduce one concept we didn't have here. It comes back to knowledge management, but there's the idea of knowledge graphs, which is really what you need to manage this in the large language model context, where it's codifying the knowledge and the meaning of words for a particular domain, a particular company, a particular use case. And up until now, those have been painfully difficult to build by hand, but we're seeing AI will help automate those. Watch this as something I think is going to become strategically important. But yeah, polysemy is a big deal with these large language models. And unless you have some way to constrain it, you run into trouble. But if you're a terminologist or other, hey, it's your time to shine in the sun.
Right.
Yeah, or to provide the context, because I think what large language models are particularly good at is to capture context around a word. And I assume the meaning of the word is driven by the context within which it occurs. And that, again, to Arle's point, requires some expertise to set it up in the right way. But I think that's one of the things you could solve for.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, look, I think we're about at time. And I hope for the audience we have helped understand some of the hype around hyperautomation and some of the value that I think we all believe that it can bring to every organization, and how it's going to drive really the future of localization and technology and localization. It remains for me to thank the audience for joining us, and thank Arle for his thoughts and Simone for her thoughts. And we hope to see you next time.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Yes. Bye.